Let's take a look at some of the official AWS material here that I teach at some of the universities where we study the AWS platform. And to start with, you can see here, this is their concept of a machine learning pipeline. And there's a few things that are important to look at here. And this will come up if you're going to take the AWS machine learning certification exam. The first one is the business problem. And this is also relevant in the real world, but is your company able to formulate a problem? For example, we want to classify the customers that buy large purchases, or we want to find out whether there's fraud in our credit card transaction system. Really, this is where you would actually spend a lot of your time right here, is making sure that you have the ability to understand what it is you're doing. Next, you have to figure out how to collect this data. And this is really where this next section comes up. And once you've collected the data, you also need to label the data. So, what is the object that you're going to train for in the future, or what is the successful fraud, or what is an example of a customer that purchases large purchases. Those all have to be labeled. And then finally, you'll go through here and evaluate this data. Once you've evaluated the data, you're ready for one of the more fundamental aspects of machine learning here, which is this concept of feature engineering. I'm starting this because it's so important, and this is where really you're going to pull from when you go through and you train your model. So next step here would be under this feature augmentation step here, is you take all this data and you move it through the pipeline of training it with Sagemaker, and then going through and tuning the model, potentially doing hyperparameter tuning. This is an important step here that Sagemaker can help you with. And then finally, when you're done, you have to ask again, does this model meet the business goals? Finally, you go through and you would deploy that model. So it's an important thing to consider when you're building things with Sagemaker, or if you're taking the AWS machine learning certification. What is it that you care about in terms of the problem formulation? How do you collect the data? How do you evaluate it? How do you bring it into feature engineering? And then finally, once you've decided whether it meets your goals or not, what do you do about new data and retraining? And this is where things like the model versioning comes in with Sagemaker. Let's take again a look at how you would deploy a model with Sagemaker according to the way AWS sees the world. To start with here, you can see that there is training data that's inside of S3. You've got the models as well that are in S3 here. And then Sagemaker allows you to use this helper code to pull that model data, or use the helper code to pull the training data. And then at that point, you can decide what step you want to do. In the case of inference, this is where the prediction takes place. And that prediction would go through and run on particular instances that are designed to be good at doing predictions. For example, they could have GPUs or elastic GPUs. Likewise, in this training code section here, this is where you would also decide what kind of machines you'd want to run. Potentially, you could use them CPU heavy, or you could use versus GPU heavy. Those are all design characteristics of how you would deploy a model. Finally, the client can request, if it's an online endpoint, a prediction. And this is one of the advantages of using something like Sagemaker, is that you can build out an elastic and scalable cluster of predictions, and you can go through and really focus on the model versioning, the data versioning, and this is one of the advantages of Sagemaker. A newer feature of Sagemaker that comes with Sagemaker Studio is this concept of autopilot. Let's dig into it a little bit. How does it work? Well, the core idea here is that you have some test data, you have some training data, and you have a target. And what you want to do is use the Sagemaker Autopilot to automatically determine how to analyze the data, how to then perform feature engineering on the data, and then how to do model tuning. And your outputs are going to be a trained model and also the model metrics data. So really the idea with Autopilot is that it is a simplification. And what's great about this simplification here is that at scale, when you're training maybe thousands of models per month, this Autopilot feature can really streamline the use of machine learning in an organization. And that's one of the reasons to use a platform like Sagemaker. In the book that I just published, Practical MLOps Operationalizing Machine Learning Models by O'Reilly, One of the things I cover in the first chapter is AWS SageMaker. It really is a good example of why you would use a platform. And let's walk through this diagram here. So you can see here, this is AWS SageMaker project architecture elasticity. In a traditional, let's say, notebook-only data science workflow, at the very beginning here, you're going to ingest the data. You're later going to do EDA, you'll do some modeling, and you'll build a conclusion. Now, in the real world, with a petabyte of data or 100 terabytes of data, you're going to need to use a cloud platform to help you with this. And so this is where this ingestion phase will pull the data from S3. Later, you would then go through and use potentially a cluster of machines to do exploratory data analysis. And this is where we see this blue diagram here. And then in modeling as well, you could use a cluster of machines to train the model and then ultimately serve it out via endpoints. So let's take a look down below here. So the first thing, you're going to need to launch an instance, and this would actually be, potentially a medium-sized instance where you would start to work. Now, once you want to do exploratory data analysis and clustering and maybe principal component analysis as a exploratory data analysis step, or even a modeling step, you would need to spawn multiple versions of EC2. So you would have maybe 3 EC2 instances for the PCA modeling, and you would have 3 EC2 instances for the k-means clustering. This is all going to need to be orchestrated by SageMaker, and this really highlights why a platform is so important. It also is going to need to go back and forth and communicate with Amazon S3, which is the data lake. And this data lake is going to need to scale up and down according to disk IO. And then later, when it's complete with the training job, it's going to persist that version down here into Amazon S3. And then later, when we're ready to deploy a particular version of the model, you would spin up a endpoint here, and then those as well would be able to be multiple machines that are distributed. So in a realistic scenario, you're going to need potentially a dozen, maybe a couple dozen machines that are involved in the training, involved in the hosting. And that's really where a platform like SageMaker really comes into play, and it really helps you and a whole team develop solutions together with machine learning. Now let's take a look here at some of the official documentation for SageMaker. You can see here that SageMaker, here's the features. We've got SageMaker Studio, and that's what we're going to take a look at in a second. This is really like an IDE for building machine learning. There's the model registry where we can keep track of the versions and the lineage of how the model was created. There's projects, which are the end-to-end projects that have CI/CD. We also have the model building pipeline. This allows us to create and manage machine learning pipelines. We also can do ML lineage tracking. This will, again, show us where the machine learning models came from. There's also a data wrangler, so you can import, analyze, prepare, and featureize data. And so this really streamlines the pre-processing steps. You can also add your own Python scripts. There's a feature store as well, so that once you discover the features, you can reuse those features. And in fact, you can have an online or offline. The online can be used for low latency, and the offline can be used for, let's say, batch jobs that you're going to train in the future. The Jumpstart these are like curated one-click solutions. We're going to go ahead and take a look at some of these as well. And then there's a few other features here. Clarify, which allows you to detect bias and explain the predictions. There's SageMaker Edge Manager, which allows you to deploy models that have efficient runtimes, like edge-based runtimes. There's also Ground Truth, which is really an important step, which is a process that helps you create labeled data sets. And then there's a couple more here. There's Augmented AI, which is a new feature. And then there's Studio Notebooks, which is the next version of SageMaker Notebooks, which has more enterprise features like SSO integrations. There's also experiment tracking, and then also debugger, and also autopilot. Again, this will allow you to automatically create models. You can model the monitors. You can train the models once and run them anywhere with this Neo. There's also elastic inference, which allows you to speed up the throughput. And then there's a few other things as well: reinforcement learning, pre-processing, batch transform. So in a nutshell, there's really a ton of features. They're only going to get more and more features, and really it's a great platform for developing things for the enterprise. So to start up with, let's take a look at this. Like if I go to SageMaker here, you can see here's my SageMaker interface, and let's look at the different things here on the left. You'll see that there's a whole series of different utilities. There's ground truth, there's notebooks, there's processing, training. It may be a little bit overwhelming at first, like, well, where do I start? A good place to start would be the Explorer SageMaker Studio, because it really is the IDE for building machine learning. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and click SageMaker Studio. The first thing that's going to happen is it's going to ask you to create a SageMaker domain. So we're going to go ahead and do that. I'm just going to select default here, and I'm going to say I want to use the default VPC, and then I'm going to select one of the subnets. We're ready to go. Okay, so now we're getting started here, and I can really wait for this default domain here to be set up. And you can see here that the status of the domain will eventually go into ready, and then I'll be able to use it. All right, so we are able to now use SageMaker domain, and we can go ahead and say launch app, or we can say launch studio. And this will go ahead and launch the Amazon SageMaker Studio, which allows us to interact with all of these advanced features. So this is really version 2 of AWS SageMaker. All right, so now we're in this default view here where we can look at all the different things you can do with SageMaker. And let's just go through here and highlight a few of the different features. So on the left here, if we look at this icon, this one gives us the ability to really look at all the resources that are available inside of my environment. I also can look at this next icon, which is a Jumpstart. And this Jumpstart is really a place where you can start to jump into pre-built solutions, one-click solutions, and it's a great place to get started. You also can go to open tabs here. This is the commands that we could run. So you could see there's lots of different things here: change kernels, look at the help menu, really like a full IDE like Visual Studio Code. If we click on here, this shows us more information about what's happening. So are there any instances running? What's going on in our SageMaker Studio platform? And then if we click on this icon here, this gives us the ability to interact with a source control repository, which again is very normal for an IDE. And if we click on here, this shows us the file system. So probably a good place to start here would be if I go back to this original section here, this SageMaker Jumpstart, we can scroll down here and just take a look at all the different things you can do. You can deploy vision models, you can deploy tabular models. You can also take a look at algorithms. There's also example notebooks as well, like how to train with spot instances would be a really good one to go through. And then also there's video tutorials as well. So what we're going to start with though at the very beginning here is we're going to say file, and we're saying new, and we're going to create a new experiment. So let's go ahead and do that. And now notice here it says autopilot experiment settings. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And what we can do is we can say we want to do NBA experiments. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to scroll down and connect it with a section of my data. So this is the important part, is I'm going to need to have some access to data here. And so what I can do is just get into a bucket here real quick, and let's actually take a look at some data that I'm going to use. I've got one from a project I've played around with here before, NBA Autopilot, and this is just some information about the NBA from 2017 that has the statistics, also some information about their salary and their social media. So a pretty small data set, but potentially interesting. So if I go back here, we know that that's the name of the bucket that I'm going to need to point it to. So let's go ahead and go here, and let's type the name of the bucket here. Let's see. There we go. Look, we can select it here. It looks like it's going to be able to find it. There we go. Autopilot. Perfect. And now what about the data set file name? So this would be what the name of the file is, even though this is let's put this bucket here, NBA. Let's actually just refresh this a little bit, and we'll say NBA Autopilot. There we go. Let's go ahead and select that. And next, what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select the data set here. And so I'm going to select this all seasons, which would be a good data set for us to play around with. And then I'm going to say, is your S3 input a manifest file? No. Now we're going to need to select, what do we actually want to predict? I could predict, the height, for example. I could predict how many points they're going to score. But I think a good one potentially would be, let's look through here and see if we can find a, let's see if we can find a good one to predict. I think a good one to predict in this particular example here would be the points that they would score per game. Let's go ahead and pick that. And then, where do we actually want to, push this data? And this would be something where we could go through here and say the S3 bucket must be in the same region because it doesn't allow requests. So we can go through here and just say right here the same bucket. This would be a good location for it. There we go. And we can even put in the S3 syntax. There we go. And now we would want to go through here and do as well some information that allows us to pick exactly what it is we want our algorithm to do. So, for example, would our algorithm do we want to automatically select it? Do we want to, pick it ourselves? These are all really cool things that you can do. So we could tell it it's going to be a regression problem since we know it's points, or we could do automatic. Let's go ahead and use automatic. What kind of objective metric? Mean squared error. Do you want to run a complete experiment? Sure, let's go ahead and do this. And we could also auto deploy that model and put it into production if we wanted to. I'm going to go ahead and say off, and I'm going to go ahead and create an experiment. So what's great about this is that that's all I need to do. I just need to point it to a data set, train that model, and then it will go through and run a prediction for me, and then later I could deploy that into production. So there's a lot to like about that, especially if you're a busy data scientist and you need to really get results done quickly. And again, when it's done, you'll be able to actually see that results inside of this tuning module. 3, 2, 1. So while that's running this experiment, let's go ahead and take a look at this Jumpstart and see if we can figure out potentially another one that would be fun to play around with. We can see there's different featured content here. We've got financial tab text, an example notebook for NLP scoring, multi-categorical ME data. We have a corporate credit rating prediction, use companies' financial data, predict corporate credit rating. And then we also have these end-to-end solutions as well, fraud detection, explain credit decisions. And then we also have pure text models here, which again, we could just deploy, there's vision models. So let's go ahead and take a look at a vision model now. So let's go ahead and select this. And what's nice about this is, notice if I go through and I select this vision model, basically it'll automatically push this into production, and then from there I can just start using that in my project. So I don't even have to open up a notebook at all. It's all done for me. So really, this is a very different model than potentially what you're used to. Now let's take a look next here at example notebooks. So this one would be how to train spot instances. We can also see how to use Keras here with the Horovod. And then we can also look at some of these other models as well that look pretty fun to play with. So maybe this is a good one to play with, NLP score dashboard. Let's go ahead and click that. And if we go through here, this is data on annual reports, which are pretty detailed, right? And so all we need to do to run this thing is we just say import notebook. And once we import notebook, what's going to happen is it'll start a kernel for us and allow us to start experimenting with this machine learning job. And you can see here the kernel is starting. It's shows us how much memory is there. Now notice again, if I go back to my resources section, which is right here, I believe, Sagemaker resources, notice here that this thing will start showing us more and more services inside. And so we can actually go through here and not only look at all the projects, but if we go to this section under running instances and we say refresh, this will also start showing up these different resources in here as well. So we can also track how many different experiments are running. This is really like a centralized command station. So let's go ahead and give this a second. Let's take a look at a few things here. Now that we've got this kernel loaded, you can see here we've got four virtual CPUs, 16 gigs of RAM, and actually a GPU. So this thing's all set up and ready to go. And notice under this tab here as well, if we highlight over it, you can see that the running terminals and kernels section here, it shows us the size of the instance. It also shows us what kind of applications we're running and also what kind of terminals we're running, which are none right now. And this is, again, an amazing feature because it allows us to really get visibility into what's happening. Now, notice here, these are the sections here for controlling the notebook. And I'm going to go through here and just run through some of this code. So the first thing that we're going to do is download this. So if I go through and I run this, notice that it's a very fast machine, right? So it's going to automatically run all this code. Next up, I'm going to do a pip install here to install this library. This is a very common syntax. Again, it's nice because it's a very fast machine here. And then we can go through and run some helper methods here inside that will collect some things. So once we do that, what'll happen is that the next block will load AWS resources. So this is really common in Sagemaker, is that you'll go through import Sagemaker, maybe import Boto 3 so you can talk to other parts of the AWS SDK. I'll go ahead and run this. And so this cell right here will need to wait until this other one is finished. So that's the big takeaway here. And it looks like it's still installing Torch. Okay. Perfect. Now if we scroll here, we can go to this next section here. Great. So now that I've got that loaded, this next section here is going to load next. It's downloading this data so that we can do natural language processing. You can see it's downloading right here, 31%. So again, this is a very common workflow in a regular Jupyter notebook with Python-based data science tools. But in this case, we're in the cloud. We're using the native Sagemaker technologies. And this allows us to really take advantage of things like, for example, a GPU cluster, good RAM, and also the deep integration with the rest of AWS, like being able to talk to S3. Okay, it looks like it's about finished here. And then once this thing is complete, the next cell here will run. Now notice that because we're still waiting for this thing to run, that this asterisk here is basically will show us when it's actually complete doing whatever it needs to do. There we go. It looks like it's doing a little bit of package installation. Great. If we scroll down here, again, we have a whole history of every single thing that it's doing. Uh-oh, it looks like it's done. Perfect. Look, now that cell has been completed. And now we can go through here and we can run these other pieces of code. And now we can actually go through here and run the rest. So from here, it would just be, again, step by step, go through, load the data, copy the data into the studio bucket, and so on and so on. And then we can actually go through and build out the rest of the Sagemaker model. So in a nutshell, this is a great process to play around with on your own. And finally, when all this is done, you'll be able to actually start to do some of the automated machine learning tasks inside of Sagemaker Studio. So that's probably a good place to stop here. And I'll just show one more thing, which is this NBA experiment. Notice that this thing's been running for a little bit, and this is the phase, right? So it's pre-processing, it generates some candidates, it's doing feature engineering, and then finally it'll actually come through here and basically tell us what it is that it's doing and even explain how it came up with the results. So if we go through here and we say open exploration notebook. This will be available when this thing is actually run, or open candidate generation notebook as well. These are all things, again, I have to write any code and it will actually generate these things for me. And you'll be able to see eventually as well, when it's gone through here, all of the different characteristics of the experiment, including how long it took, and maybe where the final models are actually located, and things like the objective metrics. So I think the best way to really wrap things up is to launch an instance of SageMaker, play around with some of these jumpstart locations, and then when you go through and run these models, you can really experiment for yourself and get familiarity with the SageMaker platform.